The morning Marcus Holt padlocked the front door of Mercer's kitchen, he was smiling, not the polite kind of smile a man puts on when he knows he's done something wrong. The real kind, satisfied, unhurried, the smile of someone who had planned this for a long time and was finally watching it land. He stood on the sidewalk in his pressed coat while Evelyn's hands were still covered in flour, while the biscuits she'd started at 4:30 that morning were still rising in the oven, and he told her the building was no longer hers. The deed had been transferred. The debt she hadn't known existed had been called. The lawyer beside him didn't look up from his papers. Evelyn was 29 years old. She had worked in that kitchen since she was 8. Her mother had died at that stove. And Marcus Holt, her father's business partner of 11 years, the man who had sat at their family table every Christmas, stood there and smiled while she read the eviction notice a second time, then a third, because her brain refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. If that were you, if everything you had ever built, everything your family had poured their lives into, was taken from you in the time it takes to read a single page, what would you do? Would you fight? Would you fall apart? Or would you walk away and find a different kind of battle, one nobody saw coming? This is the story of Evelyn Mercer, a woman who arrived at a stranger's ranch with a battered cookbook and nothing else, a woman every hardened cowboy underestimated, and a woman who quietly changed the fate of everyone around her, not with a weapon, not with money, but with something far more dangerous. Watch this story all the way through, because what happens at that dining table in part 3 will shock you. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit like and leave a comment telling us your city and country. We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the morning Marcus Holt smiled. Evelyn didn't cry in front of him. She made that decision in the first 10 seconds, not out of pride exactly, more out of the stubborn, practical part of her brain that had kept her functional through every hard thing her life had thrown at her so far. She folded the eviction notice once, then again, and tucked it into the front pocket of her apron like it was a grocery list she'd deal with later. "The biscuits are going to burn," she said. Marcus blinked. That wasn't the reaction he'd prepared for. "Evelyn, I know what it says." She turned and walked back through the front door. The padlock hadn't been applied yet. The lawyer was still sorting through his briefcase. And she crossed the dining room floor she had mopped the night before, pushed through the swinging kitchen door, and pulled the biscuits out of the oven 40 seconds before they would have darkened past saving. She set the pan on the cooling rack. She untied her apron. She looked around the kitchen one last time, the cast iron her mother had seasoned for 30 years, the handwritten recipe cards pinned to the board above the prep counter, the single window above the sink that caught the morning light just right. And she understood, in the clear and terrible way you understand things you've been avoiding, that she had known something was wrong for months. The books Marcus kept saying he'd get to, the invoices he handled alone, the meetings she wasn't invited to, she had known. She just hadn't let herself look directly at it. She took the cookbook from the shelf above the spice rack, her mother's cookbook, the one with the broken spine and the pages soft from handling, and the coffee stain on page 47 that her mother had never bothered to cover up because she said stains meant a book was being used. She put it under her arm. Then she walked out the back door and didn't look back because she already knew if she looked back she wouldn't be able to stop. The town of Crestfield was small enough that word traveled before Evelyn reached the end of the block. She saw it in the way Mrs. Peterman paused on her front step, in the way Thomas Briggs at the hardware store suddenly found something urgent to examine in his window display. Nobody spoke to her. Some of them looked sorry. Some of them, she noticed, didn't look sorry at all, just fascinated, the way people are when something bad happens to someone else and it isn't them. She spent 3 days in the boarding house above the dry goods store trying to understand her legal options, which turned out to be nearly non-existent. Marcus had been meticulous. The loan documents were legitimate, taken out in the restaurant's name 2 years prior, signed with her father's signature, her father who had been ill the last year of his life, and who had trusted Marcus absolutely. Whether her father had understood what he was signing was a question nobody seemed to want to answer. On the 4th day, Evelyn read the back page of the regional paper and saw a help wanted notice. Cook needed. Blackstone Ranch. Room, board, and wages. Inquire by letter or arrive in person. She had $31 to her name, a cookbook, and a change of clothes. She arrived in person. The road to Blackstone Ranch took most of a morning on a hired cart, and the driver, a wiry older man named Ott, who didn't seem to require conversation, left her at the end of a long dirt track and pointed west. The main house was a square, serious-looking structure that had clearly been built to last rather than to impress. The outbuildings were clean but worn. The fence lines were straight. Everything about the place had the look of a person who paid their debts and expected others to do the same. She knocked on the front door and nobody answered. She knocked again. She was considering whether to walk around to the back when the door opened and a man stood there looking at her like she was a problem he hadn't scheduled. He was somewhere in his early 40s, with the weathered look of a man who spent most of his hours outside, and the kind of stillness about him that some people mistake for calm, but which Evelyn recognized, having grown up around her father's business, as the stillness of someone permanently braced for the next thing to go wrong. "You're here about the cook position," he said. It wasn't a question. "Rowan Hayes?" "That's right." "Evelyn Mercer. I cooked professionally for 11 years. I know stocks and field cooking, preservation, baking, and quantity cooking for large groups. I can start Monday if you want, or tomorrow if you need." He studied her the way he might study a horse he wasn't sure about, not unkindly, just carefully. "How old are you?" 29. Old enough to know what I'm doing, if that's what you're asking." "It's not." He leaned against the doorframe. "My last cook was 62 years old, 4 inches taller than you, and could carry a soup pot with one hand. She fed 18 men, sometimes more. The work isn't light." "I didn't say it was." "You've never done ranch cooking." "I've never done it here," Evelyn said. "That's different." Something moved across his face. She couldn't tell what. He looked past her toward the yard, then back at her. "The men eat at 6 in the morning and 6 at night. Noon meal gets packed and taken to the field. Kitchen budget is tight, and I won't expand it because someone gets fancy ideas. My last cook kept her opinions about ranch business to herself, and I'll expect the same." "Understood." "You got references?" She had thought about this on the road. "I had an established restaurant in Crestfield for 11 years. Ask anyone in that town who ate there. I don't have a letter because the person who would have written it stole the building from under me 3 weeks ago, so you'll have to decide based on what's in front of you." There was a pause. A long one. The kind where Evelyn could feel the rejection forming. "1 meal," she said. "Let me cook 1 meal. Judge me after you taste it, not before." Rowan Hayes looked at her for another moment. Then he pushed the door open wider. "Kitchen's in the back. Don't touch anything until I've shown you where things are." She touched everything before he finished showing her, which was not defiance so much as the natural behavior of a person who needed to understand a space by handling it. She opened every cabinet, tested the draft on the stove, lifted the lids on the storage crocks, and ran her finger along the inside of the flour barrel to check for moisture. Rowan watched this without comment, which she took as either patience or resignation. The pantry was adequate. Not generous, but workable. Dried beans, salt pork, some aging root vegetables, a fair amount of cornmeal, 1 decent wheel of cheese that had been poorly wrapped and needed the outer edge trimmed. The spice shelf was sparse. Salt, black pepper, dried thyme, 1 jar of something labeled only red that turned out to be paprika. The butter supply was good. The eggs were fresh. "When do the men come in?" she asked. "Hour and a half." She was already tying on her apron. What she made was not complicated. She had never believed that impressive and complicated were the same thing, a conviction that had occasionally frustrated her customers in Crestfield who wanted to feel that what they were eating required suffering to produce. She made a beef stew with the salt pork and the root vegetables, building the base slowly so the fat rendered into something rich and deep rather than greasy. She made cornbread in 2 of the cast iron skillets, adding a handful of the cheese in thin shavings across the top. She soaked the dried beans for the following morning. She found a crock of preserved plums in the back of the pantry that nobody had touched, and she made a simple compote with the last of the day's butter and a bit of sugar, which she set aside for after. She did not taste as she worked, not out of confidence, but because she had learned long ago that the cook who tastes every step is a cook who adjusts out of anxiety rather than knowledge. She knew what the stew would taste like before she made it, the same way a musician knows how a chord will sound before they play it. The men came in at 6. There were 16 of them, not 18, and they were dirty and tired and loud in the specific way men are loud when they've been working hard all day and have temporarily forgotten how to modulate their voices. They sat down without ceremony, and the noise dropped by half when the first bowls were set in front of them, not because of any particular expectation, but simply because eating is a quieting activity. Then the noise dropped the rest of the way. Not to silence, to something lower and more concentrated than silence. The sound of people paying attention to what they're eating. Evelyn stood at the kitchen door and watched. One of the younger cowboys, barely past 20, with the sunburned neck of someone who'd only been outside for a season, looked up from his bowl with an expression of genuine bewilderment, as if the food had surprised him in a way he hadn't been prepared for. The man beside him said something low, and the younger man nodded slowly, and Evelyn allowed herself one quiet exhale. Rowan was at the head of the table. He ate steadily and without drama, and she couldn't read anything from his expression. He was the kind of man whose face had learned not to give things away, which was either a professional habit or a personal one, and she suspected it was both. It was an older man, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, the kind of presence that suggested he'd been at this ranch longer than most, who finally said something. "Where'd you find her?" he asked, directing this at Rowan. "She found herself," Rowan said. "Tell her the plum thing is the best thing I've eaten since my mother's table." He paused. "Don't actually tell her that. She'll want a raise." There was laughter, not polite laughter, real laughter, the kind that happens when people aren't expecting to laugh and something catches them off guard. Evelyn stepped back from the doorway before anyone saw she was smiling. She was given a small room off the kitchen, which had been the previous cook's and which still held some of her things: a hand mirror, a pair of worn boots that didn't fit Evelyn, a small calendar with certain dates circled for reasons that would remain forever unknown. Evelyn put these things in a box and left them by the door to be returned whenever someone knew how to return them, and then she made the bed with the spare linens she found in the hallway closet and sat on the edge of it in the dark and took stock of her situation. She had a job. She had a room. She had $31 still in her coat pocket because the position came with room and board, and her first week's wages would follow. She had lost everything. She was starting over in a place where nobody knew her, cooking for men who had not asked for her and had no particular reason to trust her. The person who had taken her family's restaurant was almost certainly sitting in a warm house right now, not thinking about her at all. She opened her mother's cookbook, not to any particular page, just held it in her lap in the dark, feeling the weight of it, the familiar soft worn cover, the slight give of the spine. Her mother had written in the margins, not recipes, notes, observations, bits of advice that had nothing to do with cooking and everything to do with how to be a person in the world. Don't make your fear someone else's problem. That one was written in the margin of the brisket page. The table is the only honest room in any house. That one was next to the recipe for bread pudding, which her mother had never actually liked but had made for 30 years because other people did. Evelyn closed the book and lay back on the bed with her boots still on. She was going to have to be very careful here. She could already see the shape of this place, the way the men deferred to Rowan, the way Rowan carried the weight of the ranch like something he'd stopped expecting anyone else to help him carry. She could see the gray-bearded man, she'd later learn his name was Clem, was the social spine of the bunkhouse, the one who set the tone. She could see that two of the younger cowboys had been watching each other across the table with the specific tension of a disagreement that hadn't been resolved. She could see all of it because she had spent her entire working life in a room where people let their guards down to eat. And she had learned that the table shows you everything if you know how to look. She was not going to interfere with any of it. She was going to cook. She was going to do her job. She was going to keep her head down and rebuild what she could from what she had. That was the plan. The first week was harder than she let on. Not the cooking. The cooking was the easiest part, the one thing she could do by instinct and muscle memory and sheer accumulated knowledge. The hard part was everything around it. The logistics of a working ranch kitchen that fed people on a schedule tied to work rather than appetite. The learning of individual preferences that mattered in ways nobody articulated but everyone noticed. If you ignore them, the particular physics of keeping food hot for 18 people when the dining table was 60 feet from the kitchen stove. One of the men, a stocky fellow called Denny, who had the look of someone who'd been suspicious of everything since early childhood, made a point of finding fault with something at every meal for the first 3 days. The cornbread was too thick, the coffee was too strong, The beans hadn't soaked long enough, which was plainly impossible given that Evelyn had soaked them for 12 hours. But she didn't argue because Denny's objections had nothing to do with the food and everything to do with the fact that she was new and untested, and he didn't trust new and untested things. She understood this. She had been the same herself once. On the fourth day, she served the cornbread thinner. She made the coffee exactly as strong. The beans were perfect. Denny ate 2 helpings and said nothing, and that was as close to an endorsement as she was going to get from him, and she accepted it. Rowan came to the kitchen on the 5th morning while she was starting the breakfast bread. He stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing himself, which she noticed but didn't acknowledge. "You're up early," he said finally. "Bread takes time." "Martha, the previous cook. She used the store bread." "I know. I found the account with the Crestfield Bakery in the pantry ledger." She turned the dough without looking up. "Store bread is fine. This is better and cheaper. It also means the men eat breakfast with something warm in front of them, instead of something that was baked 2 days ago and wrapped in paper." Another pause. She had noticed that Rowan communicated as much in pauses as in words, and she had started listening to the pauses. "There's a problem you should know about," he said. She looked up then. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the small table near the window, the one she'd decided was for private conversations, as distinct from the doorframe where he'd been standing, which was for checking in. She'd already mapped the communication geography of the house without intending to. "Silas Granger," Rowan said, like that explained something. When she didn't respond, "He owns the Granger land to the east and north, about 2,000 acres. He's been acquiring property in this area for 3 years, buying what he can, pressuring what he can't buy. 2 ranches have sold out in the last year. One family left in the middle of the night and didn't tell anyone they were going." "And Blackstone?" "He's been making offers. I've declined everyone." He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "Last week, my lawyer in town received a letter from Granger's legal office. They're claiming a land rights dispute. Say there's a deed error in the original Blackstone title from 1887 that gives Granger's family a prior claim to the eastern quarter of this property." Evelyn was quiet, working through what she was hearing. "Is there an error?" "Not that I can find. But my lawyer says the documents Granger's office has submitted. Look, he used the word formidable. He thinks fighting it will cost more than I have and take longer than the ranch can sustain while the case is open. So he's trying to win in the paperwork before it ever gets to a judge." Rowan looked at her with a slight adjustment in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. "That's one way to put it." "That's how Marcus Holt took my family's restaurant," Evelyn said. "Not with bitterness, just as a fact, the way you state something you've had enough time to see clearly. You don't fight honest, you fight in the documents, where most people can't follow you." Rowan didn't say anything. "I'll keep this to myself," she said, turning back to the bread. "But I'd like to see those documents if you're willing to let me." "You're the cook." "I know what I am." She shaped the loaves without pausing. "I'm also someone who just had something taken from her using documents she didn't understand until it was too late. I'm not going to make that mistake twice, and I'll know things to look for that your lawyer might not think to." The silence this time was longer. She could hear the bread dough, slightly tacky, against her palms. She could hear the distant sounds of the bunkhouse starting to stir. "I'll consider it," Rowan said. He didn't say no. In her experience, from the men she'd known in her life, that was frequently as close to yes as you were going to get. The days settled into a rhythm that suited her, though she would not have said she was content. Contentment felt like too easy a word for a person who had lost what she'd lost, and was still close enough to it that she could feel it clearly every morning when she woke up. What she was, more precisely, was functional. She was doing the work, and the work was giving her something to stand on. She learned the men the way she'd always learned her customers, not by asking questions, but by watching what they did when they weren't performing. Clem, the gray-bearded man, was sharp and funny and well-liked, but he carried a persistent sadness she recognized as grief that had never been properly attended to. He'd had a family once. She pieced this together from small things, a phrase here, a deflection there, and something had happened, and he'd come to Blackstone the way some men came to isolated work, to outrun something that was still outrunning them. The 2 young cowboys who'd been watching each other tensely across the table turned out to have had an argument about money, a small debt between them that had calcified into something more complicated over several months. Evelyn didn't intervene. She did, however, seat them apart from each other for 2 weeks, and then, when she could see from the way they moved around each other that the worst of it had passed, seat them together again. Neither of them seemed to notice. She noticed Rowan. She noticed him the way she noticed all of them, as a piece of information to be read and understood. He was a fair man, she could see that clearly, which was not quite the same as a kind man, though he had his moments. He worked as hard as anyone on the property, harder than most. The men respected him in the particular way men respect someone who doesn't ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He also didn't ask for help, which was, she was beginning to understand, the source of the particular tension she'd sensed in him from the first day. It was the tension of a man carrying more than one person can carry alone, and having made the private decision, somewhere along the way, that asking for help was a form of failure. She'd known men like that. She'd been one herself, in certain seasons. On the 12th night, she stayed up past everyone else to do the bread starter for the following week. The house was quiet. The stove was banked low. She was sitting at the small kitchen table with her mother's cookbook open to a page she'd read 100 times, a recipe for lamb stew that required ingredients she didn't have and probably wouldn't have for months, when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Rowan appeared in the doorway. He was still dressed, though his boots were off, which she'd come to understand meant he hadn't slept yet rather than that he'd just gotten up. "You're still up," he said. "Starter needs watching." He came in and sat down at the table, the same chair as before, the one by the window. She'd started thinking of it as his chair. She kept a clean cup near the stove at night now, she realized, without having made a conscious decision to do so. She poured him coffee. He took it without comment, which by now she understood as thank you. "Granger's office sent a follow-up letter," he said. She waited. "They're proposing a meeting, here, at the ranch. They want to discuss a resolution. They want to come to your table and make you feel like they're doing you a favor," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "That's what they're doing," she said. "Coming to your space makes it feel like generosity, makes you feel like you owe them something for the trouble of the trip, puts you in the position of the host when you should be in the position of the party with the legitimate claim." She looked back down at the cookbook. "You should agree to the meeting. My lawyer advises against it." "Your lawyer isn't wrong. A meeting could expose your legal strategy and give them information they don't have." She turned a page. "But a meeting could also do something else, if you know how to run it." She could feel him watching her. The fire in the stove popped once, softly. "What do you mean?" "People don't think clearly when they're comfortable," Evelyn said. "They get relaxed. They say things they wouldn't say in a formal office. They assume the social situation, the meal, the hospitality, means the other person is operating in good faith." She looked up. "I've watched that dynamic for 11 years. I know what people give away when they think they're just having dinner." Rowan was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind picked up briefly and then fell. "You're the cook," he said again. "I know," she said. "I'm very good at it." He almost smiled at that. She almost smiled back. "I'll think about it," he said. He finished his coffee and stood. "Don't stay up all night?" "The starter needs another hour." He nodded and left. She listened to his footsteps cross the hall and go up the stairs, and she sat in the kitchen with the low fire and her mother's cookbook and the bread starter quietly working in its crock on the counter, and she thought about Silas Granger and forged documents and what a man reveals when he thinks the table means he's winning. She thought about that for a long time. The starter had done what it needed to do by midnight, and Evelyn covered it and went to bed, and she did not sleep well, which was not unusual. Sleep had been a negotiation since the morning Marcus Holt stood on the sidewalk smiling, and she had learned to take what she could get and not complain about the rest. She was up before 4. The kitchen was cold, and she got the stove going before she did anything else, standing in front of it with her hands out the way her mother had always done. Not for warmth exactly, but for the ritual of it, the familiar weight of a day beginning. By 5:30, the bread was in and the coffee was on, and she was dicing the salt pork for the morning beans when Clem appeared in the kitchen doorway in a state she'd never seen him in before. Not quite distressed, but unsettled in a way that sat wrong on a man who carried himself as steadily as he did. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." He came in without being invited, which told her something. Men who needed permission didn't come in without it. Clem moved to the table and sat down heavily and looked at his hands. She poured him coffee and set it in front of him and went back to her dicing. "You hear Rowan come in last night?" he asked. "He stopped in around 11. Had coffee." Clem nodded slowly. "He tell you about the Granger letter?" "He mentioned it. He mentioned that Granger's been buying up water rights too?" He looked up from his coffee. "Not just the land. He's been acquiring the upstream rights on the Callaway Creek and 2 of its tributaries. If he gets the eastern quarter through this deed claim, he controls the primary water access for every smaller property between here and the Denton Road." He paused. "Including this one." Evelyn stopped dicing. Not dramatically. She set the knife down with the same deliberateness she did everything, but she stopped. "How long have you known that?" "Rowan told me last week. He didn't want the men to know because he didn't want the kind of panic that makes people start making bad decisions." Clem wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I'm telling you because you're clearly not going to panic, and because I've been watching you for 2 weeks, and I think you see things." She looked at him carefully. "What kind of things?" "The kind that most people miss because they're busy talking." She picked up the knife again and went back to the salt pork. "I see what's in front of me, that's all." "Denny hasn't complained about a meal in 9 days, Clem said. "And he complained about every meal Martha made for 6 years. And those 2 boys, Garrett and Pete, they've been working without the tension between them that had the rest of us walking on eggshells for 3 months. He looked at her. "Nobody did anything about any of that. Then you showed up." "I cook for them. People are easier when they're fed properly." "Maybe." He didn't sound entirely convinced. "Or maybe you're paying attention to something the rest of us stopped bothering to pay attention to." She didn't answer that. The bread was filling the kitchen with its smell, and the coffee was dark and good, and outside the sky was beginning to go from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before first light. "What does Rowan plan to do?" she asked. "About Granger?" "He's going to fight it. He doesn't have the money to fight it for long, but he's going to try." Clem's voice had something tired in it. "He's been fighting things alone for a long time. His wife died 4 years ago. Just past 40, which is the kind of thing that either makes a man or takes something permanent out of him. With Rowan, I think it did both." Evelyn was quiet. "He doesn't talk about her," Clem said. "Doesn't mean he's stopped thinking about her. There's a room upstairs he hasn't opened in 2 years. The men know not to mention it." She filed this away without comment. She had learned early in life that information offered freely, without being asked for, was usually information someone needed to give because they were worried, and what Clem was worried about was visible enough. A man he respected was heading toward something alone that he shouldn't have to face alone. And Clem didn't know how to say that to Rowan directly, so he was saying it around the edges to the one person he'd decided might be able to do something with it. "I'll have breakfast on the table by 6, she said. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a promise. He seemed to understand the difference. The meeting with Granger's people was set for a Thursday, 3 weeks out. Rowan's lawyer, a cautious, letter-careful man named Aldrich, who drove out from town twice in the intervening period, spent most of his 2 visits advising Rowan on what not to say, which Evelyn thought was probably the right advice, but was also only half of what needed to happen. Aldrich didn't think about the table. He thought about the legal exchange, the formality, the positioning of claims and counterclaims. He didn't think about what Granger's people would do when they walked into a room that smelled of fresh bread and found themselves being fed. Evelyn thought about almost nothing else. She had one conversation with Rowan about it, direct and brief, the way their conversations tended to be when they were talking about something that mattered. "I want to cook the Thursday meal myself," she said. This was on a Wednesday evening while she was putting up the kitchen for the night. "You cook every meal," Rowan said. "I mean, I want to think about this one specifically, not just what to make, the whole of it, where people sit, how the service runs, how long each course takes." She turned to look at him. "If Granger's representative is going to be at your table, I want some say in how that table runs." He studied her. "Why?" "Because your lawyer is thinking about the legal argument. Someone needs to think about the human one." She hung the dishcloth on its hook. "When people eat, they show you who they are. If I'm in that room serving, I'll hear things your lawyer won't. I'll see things. And if the service and the food are done right, the other side will be comfortable in a way that makes them careless." "You're asking me to run my legal strategy through my kitchen." I'm asking you to let me do what I already do, just with your full permission and attention. She looked at him steadily. You hired me to feed people. Let me feed these ones the way I think they should be fed. The pause this time was different, not reluctant exactly, more like a man recalculating something he'd already decided and finding that the new calculation came out differently than expected. All right, he said. She nodded and went to bed and lay awake for an hour working out the menu. Well, in the weeks before the Thursday meeting, the ranch continued its daily turning, and Evelyn continued learning the shape of it. Not just the men, not just Rowan, but the land itself as it was described to her in the conversations she overheard and the ones she was occasionally included in. She built a picture of Blackstone from fragments. The north pasture that had the best grass but the worst drainage. The creek access that the cattle depended on through the dry months. The fence line on the eastern boundary that was older than everything else on the property and had been there when Rowan's father bought the land. She began to understand what Blackstone was, which was not just a working ranch but a life's work in the literal sense. The kind of place that represents not just a man's livelihood, but the accumulated decision of every year he'd chosen to stay and build instead of leave and begin again somewhere else. Rowan had not built this alone. His wife had been part of it, the men had been part of it, his father before him. But he was the one carrying it now, and the weight of that was visible in ways he didn't acknowledge and probably couldn't name. One afternoon, in the second week, she found him at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread out in front of him, not documents, but numbers. The ranch's accounts in a handwritten ledger, and he was going through them with the look of someone who already knows what they'll find and is hoping the second reading will be different from the first. She brought him coffee without being asked. He didn't look up. The eastern quarter, she said, looking at the spread of papers without touching them. That's where the water comes in. The best water. He turned a page. There's a second source on the north end, but it runs low by August. The creek access on the east is what keeps the herd viable through summer. He finally looked up. Without it, I'd have to reduce the herd by a third, maybe more, which changes everything about how this operation runs. That's why he wants it, Evelyn said. Not the land, the water. He wants both. The land gives him the right to the water. And if he controls the water, every smaller rancher east of the Denton Road is farming at his sufferance. He said it flatly, without drama, which made it worse. He doesn't need to own their property if he owns what their property needs. Evelyn sat down across from him. It was the first time she'd sat at that table with him in daylight, at a time when it wasn't clearly a kitchen conversation. He noticed. She could see him notice it, and then make the decision not to address it. Can I see the original deed? She asked. My lawyer has it. Aldrich mentioned they're challenging the 1887 survey. Have you seen the survey itself? It's part of the deed filing. I'd like to see it. Not the legal analysis, the actual document, the language of it. She could see the beginning of the question forming on his face. I spent 3 weeks after Marcus Holt took my restaurant reading documents I should have read years earlier. Not because I became a lawyer, but because I learned what ordinary language in those documents actually meant. People who use documents to steal things always need the documents to say something they don't quite say. There's always a gap. That's where you find it. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. Then he gathered the papers in front of him into a neat stack and set them aside. Aldrich is coming Friday, he said. I'll ask him to bring everything. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. He stood. If you read through 200 pages of land survey documents from 1887 and find nothing, I need you to be able to tell me that clearly too. I can do that. He picked up his coffee and left, and she sat at the table alone for a moment in the afternoon quiet, looking at the space where the papers had been. Outside, she could hear someone working on something metal, the rhythmic sound of repair. The ranch going on around her, not waiting for the problem to resolve itself. She got up and started the afternoon prep. Friday came and Aldrich arrived, and Rowan asked, with a casualness that Aldrich clearly found puzzling, whether Evelyn might sit in while he reviewed the documents. Aldrich looked at her the way she'd been looked at enough times to recognize, the quick calibration of who this person was and whether they mattered. And then he spread the deed and the survey, filing across the kitchen table, and began to explain what each section meant. She didn't interrupt. She listened and read simultaneously, which was a skill she'd developed in the restaurant when suppliers would describe what they had while she scanned the invoice to see whether the description matched. She read the survey language with the same patience she brought to everything, without rushing toward a conclusion, because conclusions reached too fast were almost always incomplete. Aldrich explained the challenge. Granger's documents claimed that the original 1887 survey had established a boundary marker, a specific stone cairn at the eastern edge of the Blackstone property, that had been incorrectly recorded in the deed, placing the true boundary several hundred feet west of where Rowan's deed showed it. Granger's legal team had submitted a second survey, conducted in 1901 by a different surveyor, that appeared to support this interpretation. The 1901 survey, Evelyn said. It was the first thing she'd said. Aldrich looked at her. What about it? Who commissioned it? That's not information that's been provided. Who was the surveyor? Aldrich shuffled papers. A James Colbert, operating out of... He doesn't list a home office in the documentation. Does the Granger family appear anywhere in the 1901 documentation? Not as principals, as witnesses, or as interested parties, or as the party requesting the survey be filed. Aldrich was very still. That information would need to be requested from the county record office. But it would be there, Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. Rowan was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful recalibration she'd seen on the first day. Something closer to attention. The real kind. The kind that meant he was listening for something specific. If the 1901 survey was commissioned by the Granger family, she said, or if a member of the Granger family appears anywhere in the provenance of that document, then what they're presenting as an independent correction of the 1887 record is actually a document they created themselves, and the whole claim changes shape. Aldrich opened his mouth and then closed it again. He looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at Evelyn. I don't know if that's what's there, she said. I'm saying it's what to look for. If Marcus Holt taught me anything, it's that the fraud is never in the obvious place. It's in the document that's supposed to prove the other document. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the yard. I'll contact the county clerk on Monday, Aldrich said. His voice had changed slightly, tighter, more focused. This will take time. The Thursday meeting is in 2 weeks, Rowan said. I know. Aldrich was already gathering papers. I'll be in touch before then. After he left, Rowan stood in the kitchen for a moment without speaking. The late afternoon light came through the window at an angle. Evelyn was already starting the evening bread. How did you know to look for that? He asked. I didn't know. I asked the question that hadn't been asked. She worked the dough. Someone commissioned that 1901 survey for a reason. Those things don't happen without someone deciding they need to happen. I wanted to know who decided. He was quiet for a moment. You read all of that while Aldrich was talking. I read quickly. That's not... He stopped, started again. Most people would have just listened to Aldrich. Aldrich is a good lawyer, but he's been looking at this as a legal problem for weeks, and he hasn't found the answer yet. She shaped the dough into loaves. Sometimes you need someone who's been trained to notice different things. Like what? Like when the document that's supposed to prove something is the very thing that needs proving. She covered the loaves with the cloth. That's what happened to my family. Marcus didn't use one fraudulent document. He used a chain of them, each one appearing to validate the last. You couldn't find the problem unless you went all the way back to the beginning and asked who made the thing that was supposed to be the foundation. He didn't answer. She heard him move toward the door and then stop. The men have noticed that the meals have changed, he said. Not the quality. They don't know how to articulate it. Clem said it feels like someone's been paying attention to each of them specifically. She didn't turn around. Is that a problem? No. A pause. I just noticed that they noticed. Men who feel seen work better and argue less, she said. That's not something I planned. It's just true. She heard him leave. She stood at the counter alone with her bread dough and her mother's words in her head. The table is the only honest room in any house, and she thought that this was not so different from the restaurant in the end. People were people everywhere, hungry in more ways than one, and the only question was whether you were paying close enough attention to understand what they were actually hungry for. The Thursday meeting fell on a day that started cold and warmed by mid-morning into the brittle, clear sky kind of day that made the country look very flat and very large. Evelyn was up at 4:30. She had planned the meal the way her mother had planned the most important meals of the restaurant's life. Not spontaneously, but with the specific intentionality of someone who knew that every element communicated something, and that the thing it communicated needed to serve a purpose. The menu was simple enough that no one would feel managed and substantial enough that no one could remain indifferent to it. A roasted chicken with the herbs she'd been cultivating in the pots outside the kitchen door. Potatoes roasted in the chicken's drippings. A winter salad with what she'd preserved from the last of the root vegetables and a sharp mustard dressing. Fresh bread, 2 loaves, set where everyone could reach them. For dessert, an apple cake with the dried apples from the pantry and a brown butter sauce that had taken her 30 minutes to coax to exactly the right color. The table was set simply. She'd thought about this carefully, not elegantly, not impressively, simply. The way a man sets his table who lives well and doesn't need to prove it. Granger's representative arrived at noon with 2 lawyers and a man who carried a leather satchel and didn't introduce himself to anyone. The representative himself was a polished, soft-spoken man named Caulfield, who had the particular manner of someone who spent his professional life making unpleasant things sound reasonable. He shook Rowan's hand with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times and found it comfortable. "Appreciate your hospitality," Caulfield said, looking around the main room. "Sit down," Rowan said. "We'll eat first." The seating was Evelyn's. She had put it in front of Rowan the night before on a piece of paper, simply arranged, and he had looked at it and made one change, moving himself to a position she hadn't placed him, and then said nothing, which she took to mean the rest was approved. Caulfield and his lawyers were placed in the positions that seemed like the best seats, facing the window, comfortable, slightly higher light, but which put them with their backs to the kitchen door. This meant they would hear things from the kitchen without knowing what those things were, and it meant that Evelyn, moving between the kitchen and the table, would be behind them when she moved and in front of them only when she chose to be. The man with the satchel was placed at the end. She served the first course and then moved back toward the kitchen and stood just inside the door, where she could hear without being seen, and she listened. Caulfield ate well. Both his lawyers ate carefully, the way people eat when they're watching for cues from the person in charge. The man with the satchel ate quickly and with the focused attention of someone who was there for the food rather than the conversation. Rowan ate the way he always ate, steadily, without drama, and asked questions about the road from town and the weather further north, questions that meant nothing and which Caulfield answered with the ease of a man who was confident about how the rest of the day was going to go. Evelyn brought the second course. She served Caulfield first, and as she set the plate, she watched his hands. The way a person adjusts their utensils when a plate is set tells you whether they've been thinking about what they're eating or thinking about something else. Caulfield adjusted his fork without looking at it, which meant he was thinking about something else. Good. She brought the bread. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the door. Generous offer, in my view, Caulfield was saying. Granger's position is that a resolution outside the court serves everyone's interest, including Blackstone's. The legal process is expensive and uncertain, and how certain are you of the 1901 survey? Rowan asked. A brief pause. We're confident in... I'm asking how certain you are personally. Rowan's voice was even. Not legally, you, looking at the documents. Another pause, slightly longer. Evelyn stayed very still. The survey was conducted by a professional, Caulfield said. The documentation is consistent and the filing is in order. Who ordered it? Rowan asked, the sound of someone setting down a utensil. Then, that's a matter for the legal review. I'm asking who ordered a survey of my property in 1901, Rowan said. If the survey is as legitimate as you say it is, that should be a simple question to answer. A silence fell over the table. Not the comfortable silence of men eating, but the stiff, particular silence of a room where someone is asked the question that wasn't supposed to be asked. The man with the satchel, she heard it very clearly, said under his breath to the lawyer beside him, Colbert worked for the old man, not for the county. It was barely audible, probably not intended to carry at all, probably something said in the assumption that the woman serving food had stopped listening the moment she stepped away from the table. Evelyn walked back to the kitchen. She set down the breadbasket she was holding. She stood at the counter and breathed once, slowly. Colbert worked for the old man. Colbert, James Colbert, the surveyor on the 1901 document, had worked for Granger's father. He hadn't been an independent surveyor. He'd been in Granger's employ when the document was created, which meant the document that was supposed to independently validate the land claim was authored by someone who was paid by the family making the claim. She had what she needed, more than she'd hoped for. She picked up the dessert plates she'd been preparing and carried them through the kitchen door and set them on the table with the same quietness and care she brought to everything, and nobody at that table, not Caulfield, not his lawyers, not the man with the satchel, had any idea that the woman serving them apple cake had just heard the thing that could unmake everything they'd spent 3 years building. She caught Rowan's eye as she set his plate down. Just a look, brief and level. His eyes moved to hers and stayed there for exactly 1 second. He understood. The rest of the meal passed without incident. Caulfield made his proposal, a negotiated sale of the Eastern Quarter at a price that was roughly half what the land was worth, framed as a generous resolution that would save everyone the cost and difficulty of litigation. Rowan listened with the same stillness he brought to everything and said he would need time to consult with his attorney before responding. Caulfield left satisfied. Evelyn could see it. The easy walk of a man who believes the outcome is already determined, and the other side just hasn't accepted it yet. When the horses and the wagon were out of the yard and the dust had settled, Rowan came into the kitchen. She was at the stove. She told him what she'd heard. Exactly, word for word, the way she'd committed it to memory the moment she heard it. He was very quiet when she finished. "Colbert worked for the old man," he repeated. "Someone at that table knows it. They were careless because they thought it didn't matter." She turned from the stove. "It matters. Aldrich needs to know. Tonight, if you can reach him." Rowan moved toward the door and stopped. He looked back at her. His expression was different from anything she'd seen on him before. Not soft exactly, but open in a way it hadn't been. "I should have listened to you 3 weeks ago," he said. "You listened when it counted." He seemed like he might say something else. Then he nodded, once, and left. She turned back to the stove and stood there in the quiet of the kitchen for a moment, feeling something she couldn't quite name. Not triumph, because this wasn't over, not even close. Something smaller and more honest than triumph. The feeling of having done the thing she was there to do, of having paid attention in exactly the right moment, of having been in the right place at the right time, because she had made herself useful enough to be allowed in the room. The apple cake was almost gone. She cut the remaining slice, put it on a plate, and set it on the counter for whoever came in looking for something before bed. Then she started the dishes, and the kitchen filled with the sound of water and the low warmth of the stove. And outside the sun was going down over Blackstone Ranch the way it did every evening, indifferent and faithful, the same as it had been the day she arrived, and the same as it would be long after any of this was settled. Aldrich drove out the following morning before 8, which told Evelyn everything about how seriously Rowan had conveyed what she'd heard. The lawyer arrived with mud on his wheels and his coat half-buttoned and the look of a man who had spent part of the night thinking and the other part not sleeping, and he sat down at the kitchen table with his papers already out before he'd finished his coffee. She told him what she'd heard in exactly the way she'd told Rowan. Word for word, no embellishment, no interpretation layered on top. She was careful about that. The interpretation was there and it was obvious, but she let Aldrich arrive at it himself because men like Aldrich trusted conclusions more when they believed they'd drawn them. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Colbert worked for the old man," he repeated. "That's what was said." "By which of them?" "The man with the satchel. I don't know his name." I was whispering to the lawyer beside him. "The younger one, on his left." Aldrich wrote something down. "Did anyone else at the table appear to hear it?" "No, I was in the kitchen doorway. I don't think they knew I was there." She refilled his coffee. "Or they knew, and it didn't occur to them that it mattered." Aldrich looked up from his notes. "You've thought about this kind of thing before." "I've thought about documents being used to take things," she said. "It's the same shape, whatever the thing is." He held her gaze for a moment, then went back to his papers. He spent another hour at that table going through what he already had, making notes in the margins, occasionally asking her a question about the timing of something she'd overheard, or the exact phrasing of something Caulfield had said during the meal. She answered everything as precisely as she could. Precision was the only useful thing she could offer him, and she knew it. When he left, she stood at the kitchen window and watched his wagon go down the track, and thought about Marcus Holt again, not with the sharp and useless anger that had accompanied those thoughts in the first weeks, but with the colder, more analytical attention she'd been training herself toward. Marcus had used a chain of documents, each one appearing to validate the last. Granger was doing the same thing. The 1887 survey was legitimate, which meant the only way to challenge the claim was to go after the 1901 survey that was supposedly correcting it. And the 1901 survey had been conducted by a man who was not independent but employed, which meant the document wasn't a correction at all. It was a construction. Someone had built it on purpose, knowing that by the time anyone thought to question the surveyor's independence, the original fraud would be buried under years of legal procedure. What she couldn't know yet was whether Granger himself had directed this, or whether it had been done by someone before him, his father, perhaps, who Colbert had worked for directly. The distinction mattered. If the original fraud predated Granger, he might simply be prosecuting a claim he'd inherited without fully understanding its origins. If he'd known from the beginning, the whole thing looked different. She went back to the stove. The men needed lunch. Aldrich returned 4 days later with the county records he'd requested, and the news was both better and worse than they'd hoped. Better, because the county clerk's filings confirmed what she'd suspected. James Colbert had no independent survey practice in 1901. His single filing at the county office listed his employer as the Granger family operation, which had been run at the time by Silas Granger's father, Edmund. Worse, because the document was filed through a proper legal channel, meaning that Granger's lawyers could argue it was a legitimate professional filing, regardless of who had commissioned it. The relationship between Colbert and Edmund Granger was a matter of record, not a secret, which meant the question was not whether Granger's side knew about it, but whether they expected anyone else to find it and understand its significance. They expected to win before anyone looked that closely, Evelyn said. Aldrich nodded slowly. The risk for them was always that someone would go back to the provenance of the 1901 document. If the case had moved through the courts quickly and Rowan had settled early, which, frankly, given the cost of litigation, most people would have, this never would have come up. So the strategy was speed, Rowan said. He was standing by the window, not sitting. She'd noticed he stood when he was thinking through something he hadn't resolved. Make the offer attractive enough and the legal pressure expensive enough that I'd settle before anyone had time to dig. Yes, and it nearly worked. Aldrich laid out 3 pages side by side on the table. Here's what we have. The 1901 survey document filed by Colbert. The county employment record showing Colbert's relationship to Edmund Granger. This is a property tax document that lists Colbert as a contracted laborer on Granger land for the years 1898 through 1903. And the letter from Caulfield's office proposing the meeting. He tapped the 3rd page. What we don't have is a direct order from Edmund Granger to Colbert to conduct a survey that served the family's interest rather than the county's. Without that, we have a circumstantial case. Strong, but circumstantial. Evelyn was looking at the 3 pages. The letter proposing the meeting, she said. What about it? It was sent after the legal challenge was already filed. Why propose a settlement meeting and then send their principal representative before the county records had been fully reviewed? She looked up. That's aggressive. Why move so fast? Aldrich and Rowan both looked at her. If you already have a fraudulent document in your legal filing, she said, and you believe no one has found it yet, you don't rush the settlement. You let the legal pressure do the work. It's cheaper, and it doesn't require you to show your hand. You only call a meeting early if something has changed. She thought for a moment. Or if you're worried something is about to change. You think they knew we were looking at the 1901 survey? Rowan said. I think someone told them. She said it carefully, not wanting to create a panic she couldn't support. Or they worried you might look once the challenge was filed and they wanted to close the deal before you did. She paused. Either way, the meeting was a pressure move. They weren't there to negotiate. They were there to make you feel the clock running. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, looking at his pages. Then, I need to file a formal records request for the Granger family's land survey history with the county office. All of it. Not just the 1901 document, but anything filed in the name of Granger, Edmund, or Silas, going back to 1880. He began gathering his papers. If Colbert did work for Edmund Granger on other surveys, that pattern becomes the argument. One document is an anomaly. A pattern is a practice. How long will that take? 2 weeks, possibly 3. Caulfield is expecting a response to their proposal, Rowan said. I'll send a letter tomorrow indicating that you're reviewing the proposal carefully and will respond in due course. Aldrich allowed himself a small, precise smile. Legal correspondence permits a certain constructive vagueness. After he left, the kitchen was quiet in the particular way it was quiet in the middle of a day when all the men were in the field. Evelyn began the bread that would be needed by 6. Rowan stayed, which was unusual for this hour. "You're not going back out?" she asked. "Pete's handling the north fence with Garrett." He sat down at the table. Not the window chair, the one across from it, which she'd privately classified as the chair for when something was weighing on him without an immediate solution. "I keep thinking about what you said, that someone may have told them we were looking at the survey. It was a possibility. I don't know it. It bothers me." "It should." She didn't soften that. "You have 16 men on this property, and one of them might be talking to Granger, or it might be no one, and Granger's people are simply more nervous than they should be for a side that claims to be confident." She worked the bread dough. "You know your men better than I do." "I thought I did." He looked at his hands. "A year ago, I would have said every one of them." "What changed a year ago?" He didn't answer immediately. She let the question sit. She had learned that with Rowan, questions left in the air sometimes got answered on a delay. The answer would come 5 minutes or 20 minutes later, when he'd decided whether he was willing to say the thing. "A year ago, I made a decision about the ranch's direction that not everyone agreed with," he said finally. "I brought in a new breed of cattle, a decision that cost more up front and that the older hands thought was unnecessary. 2 men left over it. 3 others stayed but weren't happy about it." He paused. "The new cattle have outperformed the old breed by a margin that makes the investment obvious in hindsight, but the men who stayed through the disagreement, I'm not sure I know exactly what they think anymore." "Which 3? He gave her the names. She filed them without reacting. She had been watching all 16 of them for weeks, and the names he gave didn't immediately resolve into a clear answer, but they were places to put more attention, and attention was what she had. "I wouldn't do anything with that yet," she said. "If someone is talking to Granger and you make it visible that you suspect someone, you lose whatever advantage you have in not knowing who." She shaped the loaves. "And you might be wrong. Granger's anxiety might have nothing to do with anyone on this ranch." He was quiet. "What would you do?" he asked. She looked up. He was watching her with the careful, measuring attention she'd felt on the first day. But something in it had shifted. It was less like an evaluation and more like a genuine question, the kind you ask someone you've decided to trust. "I'd keep watching," she said, "and I'd make sure that what gets said in this kitchen and in this house is only what I'm willing for Granger to know." The 2 weeks that followed were the tightest Evelyn had experienced on the ranch. Not loud. The surface of things held its normal rhythm, the meals and the work, and the daily turning of the season. But under that surface there was a current she could feel whenever she walked through a room, a held-breath quality to the way the men moved and spoke that told her they all understood, at some level, that something was being decided that would affect all of them. Word had gotten out, as it always does on a working property, that there was a legal dispute. Nobody seemed to know the particulars, but the general shape of it, Granger, land, the eastern quarter, pressure, had moved through the bunkhouse with the quiet efficiency of information that matters to people's lives. The men didn't ask Rowan about it directly. They were too careful of him for that. But she heard it in the conversations at the table, the careful way the subject of Granger came up and then was not pursued, the look some of the older hands got when the name was mentioned. Clem said almost nothing, which was unusual and which told her more than anything he might have said. She cooked with more care than ever during those 2 weeks, not because the situation called for performance, but because she understood, in a way she hadn't always understood, back in Crestfield, that the table was the place where people came to feel that things were holding together. If the meal was solid and warm and made with attention, it said something that no speech could say. It said, "Whatever is happening outside these walls, in here, the work continues. In here, someone is paying attention to you." She made the things she knew people needed most when they were carrying worry. Heavy, savory things that satisfied without demanding, that warmed from the inside out. Bean soup with bone broth she'd been building for 3 days. Roasted pork shoulder with the drippings turned into a pan sauce. Biscuits she varied slightly each morning. A bit of cheese one day, fresh thyme another. A touch of black pepper and garlic on a Friday that made even Denny stop at the kitchen door and ask, with studied casualness, whether there were any left. She was stretching the budget to its edge doing this, and she knew Rowan saw it in the weekly account she kept on the clipboard inside the pantry door. He said nothing. She took his silence as permission she hadn't been denied. On a Wednesday evening, 14 days after the first meeting, Aldrich's letter arrived by rider. Evelyn saw Rowan read it at the front door, saw his face do something complicated that he quickly controlled, and she went back to the stove and waited. He came to the kitchen 20 minutes later. Aldrich found it, he said. She turned from the stove. Colbert filed surveys for the Granger operation on 6 separate occasions between 1892 and 1903. The 1901 document was one of 6, and 2 of the others directly relate to properties that the Granger family subsequently purchased at below market value, in both cases after the survey established a favorable boundary interpretation. He set the letter on the table. Aldrich says that's no longer circumstantial. That's a pattern of practice. She let out a breath she'd been holding for 2 weeks. Will it hold in court? She asked. Aldrich believes so. He says no judge looking at 6 instances of the same surveyor working exclusively for the same family to produce boundary results that benefited that family will accept that the 1901 document is independent evidence of anything. He paused. He wants to file the counter-challenge by Friday. Then file it. It's not that simple. He sat down. She could see the thing he hadn't said yet, sitting on him. There's a cost to filing. Aldrich's fees are one thing. Court costs are another. And if Granger responds aggressively, which Aldrich says is likely, because once we challenge the 1901 document, we're not just defending Blackstone, we're implying fraud across multiple transactions. We could be in litigation for a year or more. And the ranch can't sustain that. Not without changes. He looked at the table. I'd have to reduce the herd, hold off on the north fence repair, probably let 2 of the seasonal men go. She was quiet, thinking through the shape of it. Outside, the evening was settling in, and she could hear the distant sounds of the men coming in from the day's work. What does Aldrich think your odds are if you file? She asked. He put it at better than even, maybe 60-40 in our favor. And if you don't file? Granger renews the settlement pressure. We go into negotiation at a disadvantage because we haven't challenged his documentation, and whatever we settle for, we lose the Eastern Quarter. He paused. And whoever else he's done this to, on those other 2 properties, they never find out what was done to them. She looked at him. I was looking at this table, but something in the set of his shoulders told her he'd already made the decision. He just hadn't said it yet, because saying it meant committing to the hard road with no guarantees. You're going to file, she said. He looked up. You already know you're going to file, she said. You're not asking me whether to do it. You're telling me what it's going to cost because you feel like someone should know before the decision is final. She held his gaze. I'm telling you I already know what it will cost. I've been watching this ranch's accounts for 6 weeks. I know what can be cut and what can't. File. He was still for a moment. Then he nodded. One small, definite nod, the kind that means something has been decided and won't be revisited. I'll send word to Aldrich tonight, he said. The counter-challenge was filed on Friday. By Monday, the news had reached Caulfield's office, and by Wednesday, a response had arrived that was, in Aldrich's careful legal language, vigorous. Granger was not accepting the challenge quietly. His lawyers filed a motion to have the county records request considered inadmissible as evidence of fraud, an argument that Aldrich described as overreaching but not without legal grounding, and attached a supplementary document that Evelyn read twice, very carefully, before she understood what it was. It was a sworn statement from a man named Harlan Pruitt. Pruitt was a former ranch hand who had worked at Blackstone for 3 seasons, from 1891 to 1893. The statement, dated 6 weeks prior, meaning it had been prepared well before the settlement meeting, which told her something important, claimed that Pruitt had witnessed Rowan's father alter a boundary fence post on the eastern edge of the property sometime in the early 1890s, moving it several feet in a direction that would have placed the post further east than the original survey line indicated. It was a claim that, if believed, would suggest the Hayeses themselves had misrepresented the boundary, which would flip the entire frame of the fraud argument. Instead of Granger manufacturing a false claim, the story became The Hayeses had been operating on fraudulently expanded land for decades, and Granger was simply correcting the record. She read it a third time. Then she set it down on the table and looked at it. "You've seen it," Rowan said. He was standing in the doorway. "Just now." "Harlan Pruitt." He said the name like something that tasted wrong. "He worked here for 3 seasons, left in '93 under circumstances I won't say were friendly." "What circumstances?" "He was dismissed for taking things that didn't belong to him. Small things. Tools. Food stores. He had a family and was in debt, and I understand why he did it, but it couldn't continue." He paused. "He blamed me. Or blamed my father. My father made the decision, and I was the one who told him. It amounts to the same thing in a man's mind when he's angry." "Does Aldrich know the history?" "I've sent him a letter." "Good." She looked at the statement again. "This is their counter to the pattern evidence. They knew as soon as we found Colbert's work history that the surveyor argument was going to be difficult to defend. This is meant to muddy the water, introduce an alternate narrative where the boundary dispute was started by your side, not theirs." She thought for a moment. "It's also meant to put you on the defensive personally. It names your father." "I know." "Is there anyone from that period who could speak to the fence line? Any records?" "My father's estate records might have something. I've been through them once after he died, but not with this in mind." He pushed off the doorframe and came fully into the kitchen. "There's also the matter of Pruitt himself." "What about him?" "Someone paid him to give that statement. He hasn't been in this county in 20 years. He didn't come back out of civic concern." Rowan sat down. "He's in debt. He always was. If someone offered him enough to make a statement and disappear again, he'd take it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought about the shape of what she was hearing. Granger's side had prepared this statement 6 weeks ago, before the settlement meeting. That meant this had been in reserve, a document held back in case the straightforward settlement approach failed, ready to deploy once the pressure escalated. They had planned for resistance. They had a counter-move ready before the game had started. "They're more organized than I thought," she said. "Aldrich said the same thing this morning." "Which means the Colbert pattern, on its own, might not be enough." She looked at him. "The statement complicates your narrative. You're asking the court to believe that Granger manufactured evidence through a captured surveyor. Granger responds by asking the court to believe that your father moved a fence post. Both claims are historical, both are hard to prove directly, and a judge trying to decide between them may decide neither side is clean and split the difference." She paused. "Which would be the worst outcome?" He looked at her. "What would you do?" She had been thinking about this since she first read the statement, working it the way she worked a problem at the stove, not rushing toward the answer, letting the components come clear one at a time. "Find Pruitt," she said. Rowan went still. "Not to threaten him or buy him back, to understand him." She kept her voice even. "A man who makes a false statement under oath is a man who has made a bargain he probably doesn't entirely feel good about. He has a family. He has debt. He agreed to put his name on a document that accuses a dead man of fraud. That's not comfortable, whatever he was paid." She looked at the statement on the table. If someone sat down with Harlan Pruitt and talked to him honestly about what this statement actually means for him, not for Granger, not for Blackstone, but for him personally, I think there's a possibility he tells a different story. "You think he'd recant?" "I think he might. If he understood that a false sworn statement is itself a crime, and that if this case goes to trial and the details come out, whoever paid him to make the statement will be very careful not to be found holding the receipt." She paused. "He's not their ally. He's their instrument. And instruments that are no longer useful tend to get discarded." The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear the bread rising in its pans. She could hear the wind outside picking up the way it did in the late afternoon. "I don't know where he is," Rowan said. "Aldrich might be able to find out. The statement had to have been taken somewhere. A notary, a legal office. That office is a trail." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to do anything dishonest. I'm asking you to find the man and talk to him before this gets to a point where he's locked in." Rowan was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. This was not a small thing she was suggesting. It required a kind of trust in human psychology that was harder for some people than others, particularly people who had learned to protect themselves by expecting the worst and not being disappointed. "I want to be the one to go," he said finally. "I think it should be you." She met his eyes. Not because of what you'd say, because of who you say it. Pruitt knows you. He worked here. He has a reason to be angry at you. But he also has a reason to remember what you were actually like, if you give him the space to do that. He looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about this kind of thing before, he said, echoing what Aldrich had said 2 weeks earlier. I've thought about what makes people tell the truth, she said. It's rarely what people think. It's rarely being cornered. Usually it's being given a moment where the truth feels easier than the alternative, and the alternative starts to look like something that will follow them for the rest of their lives. She picked up the statement and carried it to the shelf where she kept the ranch paperwork. She filed it behind the week's accounts. I'll need the bread in the oven in an hour, she said, and the men will need dinner at 6. He almost said something. She could hear the held breath of it. Then he stood and walked out, and she heard him cross the hall and take his coat from the hook by the front door, and she heard the door open and close. She turned back to the stove. There was a knot in her chest that had been there since she read Pruitt's statement, something that recognized the particular shape of what Granger was doing, the layering of documents, the planting of alternate stories, the use of a desperate person as a tool, because it was the exact shape of what Marcus Holt had done to her family. Different pieces, different place, different people. Same architecture. She understood it well enough to hate it clearly and to refuse to be paralyzed by that hatred, which was the thing she hadn't managed in Crestfield. There, in those first days after the padlock, she had spent 3 weeks angry in a way that was mostly just painful, that didn't move her anywhere or help her understand anything. She had learned in the months since that clarity was more useful than anger, and that clarity required you to look at the thing directly without flinching, even when looking at it made your hands shake. Her hands were not shaking. She measured out the flour for the morning biscuits and set it aside and checked the bread and adjusted the stove, and she worked with the focused attention of someone who has found the thing they are good at and has decided to be good at it in the service of something larger than themselves. The men came in at 6 and ate the pork shoulder and the root vegetables and the bread, and the table was loud and warm the way it had become, and nobody looking in would have known that the woman who had cooked for them had spent the afternoon reading a false sworn statement and thinking about human psychology and listening to a man walk out the front door toward a decision that would determine whether everything they were sitting in the middle of would still be here by spring. She watched the table the way she always watched it. Clem ate quietly tonight, more so than usual, and looked up once at the empty chair at the head of the table. Rowan had not come back by 6, and she'd kept a plate warm, with an expression that was part worry and part something older, the kind of faithfulness that doesn't announce itself. Garrett and Pete sat beside each other and argued good-naturedly about the best way to repair a section of fence, and she thought about how 3 months ago they hadn't been able to be in the same room without the air going tight, and about how small, consistent acts of attention had quietly rearranged the furniture of their conflict without either of them being aware a rearrangement was happening. That was the thing about tables. People forgot they were being seen after a while. They forgot to perform. They forgot to be careful. And in that forgetting, they became themselves, which was almost always more complex and more human and more worth knowing than whatever version of themselves they'd been presenting. Rowan came back at 8:30. She heard the front door and the sound of his boots in the hall, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was alone. The dishes were done. The stove was banked. She was sitting at the small table with her mother's cookbook open in her lap, not reading it, just feeling the weight of it. She looked up. His face told her what she needed to know before he said it. Not resolved. Nothing was resolved yet. But something had shifted. Some weight had moved, or begun to move. Aldrich found a notary in Ridgeton who took the statement, he said. Pruitt is in Ridgeton. Aldrich has an address. When will you go? Tomorrow morning. He came in and stood by the stove, holding his hands out toward the warmth the way she'd seen him do before, when he was tired enough that the habit overrode the self-consciousness. I don't know what he'll say. I know. It might be nothing. It might be. He looked at her. The firelight was low and the kitchen had the particular softness it got at the end of a day when the work was done and the noise had died down. Why are you still up? She looked down at the cookbook. I was thinking about my mother, she said. It came out simpler than she'd intended, but she didn't take it back. He didn't say anything to that. She was grateful for it, for the fact that he didn't offer condolence or fill the space with something that would have required her to reassure him. He simply stood by the stove and was there, which was enough. After a moment, she closed the cookbook and stood. "There's a plate for you in the warming drawer," she said. "You should eat before you sleep." "I know. And the coffee's cold. I can heat it." "Don't," he said. "Go to bed. I'll manage." She gathered her things and moved toward the door. She stopped there and looked back at him, standing at the stove in the low firelight, looking tired in the specific way a man looks when he has been carrying something heavy for years and is only just beginning to consider whether he might be allowed to set it down. "Rowan," she said. He looked up. "You're not going to lose this ranch," she said. It was not a promise she had the authority to make. She knew that. He knew that. But she said it the way her mother had said the things that needed saying. Not because they were guaranteed to be true, but because some things need to be spoken before they can have any chance of becoming true. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he gave her the small nod that she had come to understand as the fullest expression of what he allowed himself to feel. She went to bed. And in the kitchen, the fire settled low in the stove, and Rowan Hayes sat down alone with his cold coffee and his plate from the warming drawer and the weight of everything that was coming. And outside, the March wind moved across the dark land of Blackstone Ranch, the same as it had always moved, indifferent to what was at stake, faithful only to its own direction. Rowan left for Ridgeton before sunrise. Evelyn heard him in the hall at 4:30. The particular sound of a man moving quietly through a house he knows by feel, trying not to wake anyone. She lay in her room off the kitchen and listened to his boots cross the front room and the soft drag of his coat from the hook and the careful click of the latch, and then the sound of him in the yard, and then nothing. She got up and started the stove. There was nothing to do about what was happening in Ridgeton. That was the hardest part. Not the uncertainty of the outcome, but the simple fact that she had done what she could do and the next piece belonged to someone else. She had spent enough of her life trying to manage things that were outside her reach that she had learned, at some cost, to recognize when the work was someone else's to carry. This was Rowan's. He had to be the one to stand in front of Harlan Pruitt because she had been right about that. It had to be the person Pruitt knew, the person he had a history with, the person whose face carried the actual weight of what the statement would do. What she could do was feed 16 men and keep the ranch functioning and not let the anxiety of waiting turn into something visible that infected the table. She made the biscuits with cheese that morning, the ones Denny liked. She made them without deciding to, her hands going to the ingredients from habit or instinct, or some combination of the two, and she thought about that as she worked, the way the body knows what's needed before the mind has caught up to it. Clem came in early again. He'd been doing this more often since the legal trouble had become known, arriving in the kitchen before the other men, sitting with his coffee in the chair by the window, sometimes talking, sometimes not. She had come to understand this as his way of being useful in a situation where there was nothing useful he could do. The kitchen was the place where things happened at Blackstone, and being near the kitchen was as close as he could get to being near the center of what was unfolding. "He went to Ridgeton," Clem said, not a question. "Yes. To find Pruitt." She didn't ask how he knew. On a working ranch, the walls between information and the people it affected were thin, and she'd stopped being surprised by what moved through them. "Yes." Clem wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. Outside, the sky was the color of old pewter, the particular flat gray of a morning that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. "I knew Pruitt," he said, "back when he worked here. He wasn't a bad man. He was a man in a bad place for a long time, and he made some of those decisions that seemed small when you made them and turned out not to be." She was listening while she worked. "I felt sorry for him when Rowan's father let him go. I didn't say so. It wasn't my place, and it wouldn't have changed anything, but I felt it." He paused. "I feel sorry for him now, if he did what that statement says he did, because whatever they paid him, it isn't going to be enough." "No," she said, "it's not." "Do you think Rowan can reach him?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I think Rowan is the right person to try," she said. "Whether he can reach him depends on where Pruitt is in himself, whether he's made peace with the decision or whether it's been eating at him." She turned the biscuits in the pan. "In my experience, when people do something they know is wrong, it either calcifies, they build a story that makes it acceptable and they live inside that story, or it doesn't. It keeps working on them. And if it's still working on him, Rowan might find something to talk to." Clem was quiet for a moment. "You have a lot of experience with that kind of thing for a woman who ran a restaurant." She smiled slightly, not enough for him to see. Running a restaurant is mostly managing the gap between what people say they want and what they actually need. It turns out that's not so different from most things. The men came in at 6 and ate without knowing where Rowan was, or if they knew they didn't ask. And the table was normal in the way that a table can be normal when the thing that holds it together is temporarily absent, still functioning, still warm, but slightly less itself. She watched it with the part of her that was always watching and noted the specific ways each man filled the gap. Clem taking on the small mediating role at the table that Rowan usually held without seeming to, Garrett and Pete keeping their usual easy argument going, Denny eating with focused satisfaction and asking for a second biscuit, which he did by pushing his plate slightly toward the center of the table and waiting, which she had learned to read. She gave him the second biscuit. Oh. Rowan came back in the middle of the afternoon while the men were still in the field. She heard the horse in the yard and went to the kitchen window and watched him unsaddle and settle the animal, and she tried to read what she could from the way he moved. He moved like a man who was tired. That was all she could tell from a distance. He came in through the back door, the kitchen door, which he didn't usually do. She had the afternoon coffee on the stove and she poured him a cup without asking and set it on the table and sat down across from him. He drank half of it before he spoke. He was there, Rowan said. The address Aldrich had was right. A rooming house on the south end of Ridgeton, the kind where you pay by the week and nobody asks questions. He turned the cup in his hands. He looked not good. Older than I remembered, though it's been 20 years, so that's not surprising. But thin. The kind of thin that isn't chosen. She waited. He didn't want to talk to me at first, stood in the doorway of that room and looked at me like he was calculating how quickly he could close the door. Rowan paused. I told him I wasn't there about the statement. I told him I knew about it, but that I hadn't come to argue it. I came because I remembered that he'd worked hard here and that the way things ended hadn't been what either of us wanted, and I thought he deserved to hear that from me directly. What did he say? Nothing, for a while. He just stood there. Rowan set the cup down. Then he let me in. She felt something in her chest ease slightly, not all the way, but enough to breathe differently. We talked for about an hour, Rowan said. I didn't ask him about the statement directly. I just talked. About the ranch, about what had been happening, about my father, which I haven't talked about with most people since he died. He stopped. He knew my father well, better than I remembered. They'd had an actual friendship of sorts, the way a hired man and a rancher can have something like that without ever naming it. He talked about my father the way you talk about someone you actually liked. And the statement? Rowan was quiet for a moment. I told him, toward the end, that I understood that people make decisions when they're desperate that they wouldn't make otherwise, that I didn't hold it against him, the decision to leave the way it happened, and that if he'd been helped differently, I might have found a way to do that. I said that honestly. He looked at her. I don't know if it was true when I started saying it. It was true by the time I finished. She looked at him. He had the look of a man who had said something that surprised himself. And Pruitt? She asked. He cried, Rowan said. Simply, without drama, the way you state a fact that doesn't need elaboration. Not much. He's not a man who cries easily. I could see that. But he sat in that chair in that room and he put his face in his hands for a minute and his shoulders shook once. And then he stopped and looked up and asked me what would happen to him if the statement came out as false in court. What did you tell him? The truth. That a false sworn statement is a crime. That whoever paid him to make it would not stand up in court with him to share the consequences. That he would be the one holding it. Rowan turned the cup again. I also told him that the man who'd commissioned the statement, Granger, or someone on his behalf, had done the same thing to 2 other property owners before Blackstone. That other families had lost land because of documents produced by the same surveyor Granger was using to challenge my title. That Pruitt's statement was one piece of a pattern that had been hurting people for 30 years. She hadn't told him to say that. He'd arrived at it himself, and she recognized it as the most important thing he could have said. Not the legal consequences for Pruitt, but the human ones. The part that said, "You are not just doing this to me. You are one piece of something larger that has been doing this to a lot of people." What did he say? He said he needed to think. Rowan finally looked up at her fully. But he also said, and this is the part I need you to understand, he said that when they came to him with the proposal, They told him the statement would never go to court, that Blackstone would settle quickly and the claim would be resolved without any proceeding, that he was just a precaution. He didn't think he was going to have to testify. She let that sit for a moment. They lied to him about the purpose. They told him it was a formality, something to give weight to the claim if asked, nothing more. Rowan's jaw tightened. He didn't understand that if we challenged the claim and the case went to court, he'd be a witness in a fraud proceeding. They let him make the decision without full information. That's deliberate, she said. You don't tell someone the full stakes if the full stakes would make them say no. She thought of Marcus Holt and her father's signature on documents her father hadn't understood. The same shape, always the same shape. What do you need from him to be useful? Aldrich says a signed statement retracting the first one, ideally with a description of who approached him and what they said the statement would be used for. Rowan paused. He also says that if Pruitt is willing to testify to those facts, to what he was told and what he was paid, it doesn't just undermine Granger's claim on Blackstone. It opens the door to questioning every transaction Granger has made that involved a disputed boundary, going back decades. The weight of that landed fully in the room. How long did you leave him to think? She asked. I gave him 3 days. I said I'd be back Friday. He picked up the coffee cup again. I also told him I'd speak to Aldrich about his situation, his debt. I can't promise anything, and I didn't, but I told him that if there was anything to be done within reason to help him stabilize his situation after this, I would try to do it. She looked at him. I know, he said. It might look like buying his testimony. It's not the same thing, she said. Buying testimony is paying someone to say what you need. What you did was help someone understand the consequences of what he'd already agreed to and leave him free to make a different choice. The offer to help him afterward, that's not payment for testimony. That's what people do for each other when one person is in a better position than the other. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore when something she said had landed in a place he hadn't expected. My father would have done the same, he said. Maybe the same words even. She didn't answer that. It felt like something private, the observation, and she didn't want to enter it. 3 days, she said. What happens to the case in the meantime? Aldrich is filing a response to Granger's motion to exclude the county records. That buys a week. After Friday, depending on what Pruitt says, we either have the counter evidence we need or we're back to the pattern argument alone. He finished the coffee. Which might still be enough. Aldrich isn't certain, but he says it's a genuine argument. It is, she said, but Pruitt's testimony makes it more than an argument. It makes it a story. He looked at her. A judge reading documents can weigh arguments, she said. A judge hearing a man say, I was approached by this person, I was told this statement was a formality, I was not told it would be used in court proceedings. That's not an argument. That's a fact that a person says with a face and a voice, and 30 years of a difficult life visible in how they hold themselves. She picked up the empty cups. Documents can be countered with documents. That kind of testimony is harder to counter. The 3 days were the longest she had spent on the ranch. Not outwardly. Outwardly, the kitchen continued its work. The meals came out on time. The table did what the table did. But inside those days was a thinness, a waiting quality, that she managed by doing the one thing she'd always been able to do when everything was uncertain. She cooked as well as she knew how. She made things she hadn't made yet at Blackstone, a slow braised beef with root vegetables and a sauce she built from the braising liquid over 2 hours, reducing it until it was thick and serious and tasted like the accumulated effort of the time spent on it. She made a rice pudding that was more labor than the men expected from a weeknight dessert, and she watched them eat it with the slightly confused pleasure of people who hadn't expected to be given something good and didn't entirely know how to sit with that. She made Clem's coffee the way he actually liked it, which was stronger than she made it for everyone else, and which required its own small pot set aside on the back of the stove. And she did this without saying anything because some things were better unannounced. She thought about Harlan Pruitt in a rented room in Ridgeton, deciding what kind of person he was going to be on the other side of this. She thought about her mother's recipe for bread pudding and the note in the margin. The table is the only honest room in any house. She thought about what it meant to help someone without conditions attached, which was what Rowan had done when he went to Ridgeton. Not to corner Pruitt, not to threaten him, but to tell him the truth and leave him with his own decision. She wondered if Rowan had understood, when he drove out at 4:30 in the morning, that the most important thing he could do was not the legal argument but the human one. She suspected he had. She suspected it was somewhere in him naturally, the understanding that people respond to being treated honestly, and that he had simply needed someone to confirm it was the right direction before he went. On the second night she was in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, doing what she often did in the late hours, sitting with her mother's cookbook and the low stove and the particular quiet of a house where people she'd come to know were sleeping, when she heard a sound from the upper hallway that she hadn't heard before. She sat still and listened. It was a door. The specific sound of a door being opened carefully, not a bedroom door or a bathroom door, but something heavier, something that had been closed for a long time. She knew which door it was without having to think about it. Clem had described it months ago, early in her time here, the room at the end of the upper hall that Rowan hadn't opened in 2 years. She stayed at the kitchen table. She didn't go upstairs. This was not a moment that needed anyone in it except the person already in it. But she sat there and was awake, in the same house, in the way that sometimes matters without being visible. After about 20 minutes, she heard the door close again, and then Rowan's footsteps back down the hall, and then nothing. She went to bed. He came back from Ridgeton on Friday at noon. She was in the middle of the lunch preparations, and she didn't go to the window this time. She heard the horse and the yard sounds, and then the back door, and she knew from the sound of it, the way it opened fully rather than halfway, the way his step was different, before she turned around. "He'll do it," Rowan said. She set down the spoon she was holding. "He wants to meet with Aldrich directly. He doesn't want to do it by letter. He wants to say it in person to someone with legal standing who can record exactly what he says." Rowan came to the table and sat down. He looked tired, but the tiredness had a different quality than it had 3 days ago. Less compressed, more like the honest exhaustion of something completed. "He also gave me the name of the man who approached him." She sat down across from him. "Not Granger directly," Rowan said. "A man named Ferris, who Pruitt described as someone who worked as a fixer for Granger's operation. Not a lawyer, not a ranch hand, something between. The kind of person who handles things that can't be handled through official channels." He paused. "Pruitt has a letter, written to him by Ferris, outlining what he was being asked to do and what he'd be paid. He kept it." The room was very quiet. "He kept the letter," she said. "He said he kept it because he wasn't sure he trusted them, and he wanted something that showed what they'd asked him to do." Rowan shook his head slightly. 20 years of carrying that around. She thought about the weight of a letter like that, the way some people couldn't throw away evidence of something they felt guilty about, as if destroying the document would destroy the proof that they'd had a reason to feel guilty, and that somehow, however uncomfortably, they wanted the proof to exist. "Aldrich needs to see that letter," she said. "I know. Pruitt's bringing it when he comes to meet with Aldrich. Monday morning." He looked at her. "Aldrich says that if the letter is what Pruitt describes, a written instruction from someone in Granger's employ detailing the terms of a payment for a false sworn statement, the original fraud claim doesn't just fail, it inverts. Granger becomes the party facing a fraud proceeding." She let that settle. She thought about the 2 other property owners, the families who had lost land to surveys conducted by a man in Granger's father's employ, the chains of documents stretching back 30 years across this part of the country. She thought about what it meant for all of that to come into view. "It won't be fast," she said. "No, Aldrich is very clear about that. Legal proceedings of this scale, involving multiple properties, multiple transactions, a pattern of fraud going back to Edmund Granger, could take years. And the immediate case, the Blackstone title, still has to go through its own process." He paused. "But Aldrich believes the immediate challenge to our deed will be withdrawn before it ever reaches a hearing once Granger's legal team sees what we have. Because they'll know the case is lost. And because continuing the case means discovery, depositions, all of it becoming public record." He looked at his hands. "Whatever Granger decides about the broader exposure, he won't want a courtroom proceeding that puts Ferris's letter in front of a judge." She was quiet for a moment. "What about Pruitt?" she asked. "Aldrich is going to talk to the county attorney on his behalf. Not a promise. Aldrich was clear with me that he can't promise an outcome, but he can represent the circumstances, that Pruitt was misled about the purpose of the statement, that he came forward voluntarily, that the letter he preserved is the key piece of evidence. Rowan paused. It may not be enough. He still made a false statement. I know. But it's something. It's more than something. She looked at him. You could have gone to Ridgeton and pressured him. You could have made it clear what would happen to him if the statement stood. You didn't do that. It wasn't the right way. I know it wasn't, but knowing that and doing it differently, those aren't the same thing. You chose the harder one. He looked at her with the expression she still found difficult to read fully, something in it that was complicated and careful and layered with things he hadn't said. You told me to go, he said. I told you to find him, she said. What you did when you found him was yours. There was a silence between them that was different from the silences she was used to in this kitchen. Those silences had been professional, two people in a working relationship sharing a space without needing to fill it. This was something else. She could feel the edges of it. There's something I want to ask you, he said. She waited. The room I went into last night. She said nothing. He paused for a moment, seeming to recalibrate. I heard you were still up. I was in the kitchen. I know. He looked at the table. It was my wife's room. She used it as a kind of study. She kept her books there, her writing things. I closed it after she died and I haven't been in it since. He paused. Last night I went in. I don't entirely know why. I just needed to be in it. She kept her face still. I'm not telling you that for any particular reason, he said, with the careful precision of a man choosing his words honestly. I'm telling you because you were awake in this house while it happened, and I didn't want it to be something that sat unspoken between us. She understood that. She understood that he was not reaching for anything, not opening a door he expected her to walk through. He was doing what he'd done in Ridgeton, being honest with someone and letting them do what they needed to do with that honesty. Thank you for telling me, she said. He nodded. She sounds like someone who mattered to a lot of people, Evelyn said. From what I can see in this place. He was quiet for a moment. She built this ranch as much as I did. More, in some ways. The things that run well here, the way the men are treated, the sense that there are rules and that the rules are fair, a lot of that was her. He paused. The accounts were hers for the first 15 years. She was better with them than I am. The account system is good, Evelyn said. The ledger design, I noticed it early on. He looked at her. Something passed across his face. I should get back out, he said. He stood. Aldrich is meeting with Pruitt Monday morning. He'll send word by Monday afternoon. I'll be here. He went out. She heard him cross the yard and she stood at the kitchen window and watched him go, this man she had been watching for months in the particular way she watched everything, carefully, without judgment, trying to understand rather than decide. And she thought about rooms that stay closed for 2 years and ledger systems designed by people who are gone, and about the way some things persist past the person who made them, and about how that was both the saddest thing in the world and also not entirely sad. She went back to the lunch preparations. Monday came with a clarity of sky that felt almost presumptuous given the weight of what was being decided in a lawyer's office 30 miles away. Evelyn cooked through the morning with the particular focus she brought to days when she needed to be somewhere else in her mind, the body doing the work it knew by instinct, while the mind sat in a room in town with Aldrich and Harlan Pruitt and a letter that might be enough. The word came by Ryder at 2:30. Aldrich's handwriting, terse and precise in the way that legal men wrote when they wanted to be accurate and couldn't afford to be emotive. Pruitt appeared as agreed, statement given and witnessed, letter examined and retained as evidence. Letter is what Pruitt described. Written instruction in the hand of one Thomas Ferris, dated 8 weeks prior, detailing payment terms for sworn statement corroborating Granger's boundary claim. Pruitt's account of what he was told about the statement's use is consistent and credible. I am filing an emergency motion this afternoon. Do not respond to any further communication from Caulfield's office until you hear from me. This changes the shape of the case significantly. She read it twice. Then she folded it and carried it to the front room where Rowan was going over the week's accounts, and she set it on the desk in front of him without speaking. He read it. He read it again. He put it down and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk on either side of it, looking at the wall, and she watched the tension she'd seen in him since the day she arrived, the permanent braced quality, the weight of a man expecting the next thing to go wrong, shift slightly. The way ice shifts in a river when the season is beginning to change. Not broken, not gone, just different. Clem should know, he said. Yes. And the men, eventually. When you know how it resolves. He picked up the letter and folded it carefully. Evelyn. She looked at him. He seemed to be choosing between several things he could say and taking the time to find the right one. I don't know how this would have gone without you here, he said. I want you to know that I know that. She didn't deflect it. She'd learned that deflecting honest acknowledgement was its own kind of dishonesty. I did what I was here to do, she said. I paid attention. No, he said, quietly but firmly. You did more than that. And I think you know it, and I think you deserve to hear it said plainly. She held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded once and turned back toward the kitchen. The dinner that night was not special. She hadn't planned it to be. The outcome wasn't decided yet. The legal motion was filed but not ruled on, and she had learned long ago not to celebrate what wasn't finished. But the biscuits were right, and the stew was deep, and the table was warm and loud in the way that meant people felt, without being told to, that something had shifted in the direction of better. Clem ate 2 full bowls. When he looked up and caught her eye from across the room, he gave her a nod that was slow and deliberate and contained a great deal. She looked away before he could see her expression, because the thing she felt in that moment was complicated and real, and not something she was ready to hand over to be seen clearly by anyone else. She went back to the stove and stood with her hands out toward the warmth, the way her mother had always stood, and she breathed, and the kitchen smelled of bread and salt, and the faint sweet char of the stew's caramelized base, and somewhere outside the evening was settling over Blackstone Ranch, the way evenings do when they don't yet know that they are the last evenings of one kind of time and the first of another. Aldrich's emergency motion did not resolve quickly. That was the first thing Evelyn had to accept, that the law moves the way rivers move in dry season, slower than you need it to, and indifferent to your urgency. The filing went in on a Monday. By Friday, they had received only an acknowledgement that it had been received. The following week produced a scheduling notice. The week after that, a request for supplementary documentation that Aldrich described in his letter as standard procedure, and which Evelyn read as the court's way of saying, "We will get to this when we get to this." She cooked through all of it. There was nothing else to do. The ranch had its rhythm, and she was part of that rhythm now in a way she hadn't been in the early weeks. Not a newcomer being evaluated, but something closer to a fixed point. The person the day organized itself around in the mornings. The person the table relied on to be steady when other things weren't. She understood this, and she took it seriously, and she did not let the waiting turn her into someone difficult to be around, which was a discipline she'd had to practice consciously in the first 2 weeks after Aldrich's filing, when the uncertainty had a physical weight she carried in her shoulders. Rowan received nothing from Caulfield's office. Not a letter, not a legal response, not an acknowledgement of the emergency motion. Aldrich said this was notable, a legal team that had been aggressive in its correspondence for months. Going suddenly silent suggested one of 2 things. Either they were regrouping, or they already knew the case had collapsed and were deciding how to manage the retreat. He believed it was the second. He said he would not stake his professional reputation on it, but he believed it. Evelyn believed it too. She'd read enough of Granger's strategy by now to understand how it worked when it was working and how it would look when it stopped. The silence was not the silence of a side preparing its next move. It was the silence of people who had looked at what was in front of them and started doing the arithmetic on how bad this was going to be. She said none of this to Rowan. He was doing his own arithmetic, and he didn't need hers layered on top. What she did instead, in those weeks, was open the kitchen in a different way. It started without a plan. One of the neighboring ranchers, a woman named Clara Boone, who ran a small operation 2 miles east with her adult son since her husband had died the previous winter, had stopped by to return a borrowed tool, and Evelyn had invited her in for coffee without thinking about it, the way you do when you've spent years running a place where the door is always open. Clara had stayed for an hour. She drank 2 cups and talked about the difficulty of the past season and the problem with her north fence and the way her son was good with cattle but not with accounts, and she didn't know who to ask for help with accounts without paying someone more than she could afford. Evelyn mentioned that Rowan's previous cook had kept good account records. She'd found them in the kitchen files, and that the system, while old, was clear enough that anyone could follow it with an hour's explanation. She offered to sit with Clara and go through it the next time Clara had a free afternoon. Clara came back the following Thursday. Then she brought her son. Then, the Thursday after that, she brought a neighbor of hers, a man named Tully, who ran a small farm further east and who had heard from Clara that the cook at Blackstone was someone worth knowing. Rowan noticed, as he noticed everything, but said nothing for 2 weeks. When he did mention it, it was at the end of an evening in the kitchen, the quiet hour after everyone else had gone to bed. "You've been having people in," he said. "Clara Boone came for coffee, and it grew." She was at the counter putting up the morning starter. "I can ask them to come at different hours if it's a problem." "It's not a problem." He was quiet for a moment. "Tully's been struggling since the Granger pressure started. He's one of the eastern farms that's been in Granger's path. No direct legal challenge yet, but the water pressure has been real. He's been up here twice now." "3 times," she said. "He came once when you were in the South Field." Another pause. "What do you talk about?" "Accounts, mostly. The water access question. What the county records office can tell you that you don't know to ask for." She smoothed the cloth over the starter crock. "Clara's son asked about the breed decision you made last year. I told him to ask you directly." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. "You're building something," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I'm having people in for coffee." He held her gaze. He knew, and she knew he knew, that those were not the same thing, but she wasn't ready to name it more precisely than that, and he seemed to understand that too. "The coffee's good," he said finally. "I imagine that helps." Aldrich's letter arrived on a Thursday morning in April, 8 weeks after the emergency motion had been filed. Evelyn was in the kitchen when Rowan brought it in. She could tell from the way he carried it, not urgently, not slowly, but with a particular careful steadiness, that he had already understood the shape of it from the outside. He sat down at the table. She sat across from him. He opened it and read it once, fully, without speaking. Then he set it flat on the table and looked at it. "Granger's legal team has withdrawn the claim," he said. She said nothing. "Filed a withdrawal of the land dispute yesterday afternoon. No explanation offered, which Aldrich says is standard. They don't have to give a reason for withdrawal, only for the original filing, and the original filing is now the problem." He paused. "Aldrich also received a letter from the county attorney's office. They've opened an independent inquiry into the Granger family's land acquisition history in this county. The Colbert surveys, the boundary disputes, the 2 previous property transactions. All of it." He looked up from the letter. "Aldrich says that's not something they do on a hunch. Someone in the county attorney's office has been looking at this longer than we knew." "Ferris's letter," Evelyn said. "Has to be. Once that was in the legal record, it wasn't just our case anymore." He folded the letter carefully. "Aldrich says the inquiry could take a year to resolve, maybe more, and it doesn't guarantee anything. Granger has resources, and he'll use them. But it's real. It's an official proceeding with subpoena authority." He was quiet for a moment. "He can't make that go away by withdrawing a land claim." She looked at the folded letter on the table between them. 8 weeks ago, she had read Aldrich's first emergency motion letter in the same kitchen and had felt the particular held breath quality of a thing not yet decided. Now the thing was decided, or the first part of it was, the part that mattered most immediately, the part that determined whether Blackstone Ranch was still Blackstone Ranch when spring ended, the eastern quarter, the water. The fence line that had been there since Rowan's father built it, and that would stay where it was. She had expected to feel more. She sat with that for a moment, the slight flatness of a moment you have been anticipating for months when it finally arrives, the way reality is always a degree more ordinary than the version you've been rehearsing. But underneath the flatness, there was something solid, something that would be there tomorrow and the day after. "Harlan Pruitt," she said. Rowan looked up. "He should know," she said. "That it worked, that what he did mattered." He nodded slowly. "I'll write to him." Aldrich mentioned his situation, the debt, the county attorney's consideration of his cooperation. "I'll follow up on that too." He paused. Aldrich said his voluntary testimony and the letter he preserved were the difference between a circumstantial pattern argument and an airtight case. He said that on paper. Rowan looked at the letter. Pruitt spent 30 years carrying a decision that was going wrong inside him. He deserved to know it came to something. She thought about that, about what it means to carry a wrong decision for 30 years, to hold on to a letter as evidence of your own guilt, to be found by someone who came without threats and stayed to tell you the truth. She thought about what Rowan had done in that room in Ridgeton and understood again, as she had understood then, that it had been the right thing, and that the right thing had worked. Not because the world always rewards it, but because Harlan Pruitt happened to be a man in whom something had not calcified. He had stayed all those years reachable. That was not guaranteed. She knew that. You could do exactly what Rowan had done and find a man who had made his peace with the wrong decision and wasn't coming back from it. The outcome depended on who Pruitt was, not just on what Rowan did. But Rowan had made the only choice that gave the good outcome any chance at all, and that was enough. That was all any decision ever was, the choice that makes the better thing possible without guaranteeing it. Clara Boone brought a pie to the Thursday gathering the following week. She set it on the kitchen counter without ceremony and said she'd had extra dried apple and thought it wouldn't hurt anything, and Evelyn thanked her and served it after the coffee, and watched the small room fill with the sound of people eating something they hadn't expected and being quietly grateful. There were 7 people around the kitchen table that Thursday, which was too many for the table and required 2 chairs from the front room and a stool from the pantry. Tully was there, and Clara and her son, and a couple named Dewhurst who had a small homestead north of the creek, and a young woman named Iris who had come with Clara the previous week and had stayed quiet through most of it, but had asked, at the end, a precise and intelligent question about water rights documentation that had made Evelyn look at her more carefully. Rowan had come in at the end of the previous week's gathering, not by plan. He'd been coming in from the yard and the kitchen had been full, and he'd simply stopped rather than withdraw. He'd stayed for half an hour and answered Tully's questions about the breed decision with the patient specificity of someone who had thought through every variable before making the call, and Tully had listened with the focused attention of a man storing information he intended to use. This week, Rowan sat down at the table when he came in. Not at the head. There was no head. The table didn't work that way with this many people and mismatched chairs. But in the space that opened naturally when he walked in, beside Tully, across from Iris, and the conversation continued around him without adjustment, because he had stopped being a presence that required adjustment and become simply a person at the table. She noticed this from the stove. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, as information, as something that told her what was true about a situation more clearly than anything anyone said. After everyone had gone, she was washing the cups, and Rowan was still at the table, not leaving, not talking, just present in the way he sometimes was. In the late evening, when the day had been full and he wasn't ready to end it. "Iris asked you about the county records office," he said. "She's sharp," Evelyn said. "Her family's homestead has a water access question that predates her parents' purchase of the property. She's been trying to figure out how to research it without paying a lawyer she can't afford. I could talk to Aldrich. She'd rather know how to do it herself." Evelyn set a cup on the drying rack. "She's that kind of person." "Like you." She paused. Then she kept washing. "Somewhat." He was quiet for a moment. "What you've been building here," he said, "these Thursdays. I told you, coffee." "Evelyn." She stopped and turned and looked at him. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table in the posture she'd come to associate with him saying something he'd been deciding whether to say. "What you've been building here is a community," he said. 7 people around a table who didn't used to talk to each other, who are now sharing information and solving each other's problems, and coming back week after week because something here makes it feel worth coming back to. He paused. "That's not coffee. That's something you built." She dried her hands on the dishcloth. "People need a place to come," she said. "They always have. I just kept the door open and made the coffee strong." "That's not all you did." "No," she said, "but it's the part I can explain." He looked at her steadily. There was something in the room between them that had been there for months, building so gradually that she had almost not noticed it. The way you don't notice the season changing until one morning the light is different, and you realize it's been different for weeks. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. And I want you to take it seriously before you answer." "I usually take things seriously." "I know." He paused. "I want you to stay. Not as the cook, or not only as the cook. I want to ask you to be part of this in a way that's more than employment." He stopped, began again. "I'm not saying this well. You're saying it fine. What I mean is," he looked at his hands, This ranch needs what you do. Not just the kitchen, all of it. The way you see things, the way you pay attention, the way you've been building what you've been building on Thursdays. Blackstone needs that to be permanent. He looked up. And I've been alone in this house for 4 years, and I had made a kind of peace with that. And then you came and I realized the peace I'd made was just the absence of something I'd stopped believing was possible. He held her gaze. I'd like to ask you to build a future here, beside me, if that's something you'd want. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the April evening was going blue, the long, slow blue of a sky that still had light in it at an hour that had been dark all winter. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Marcus Holt and the padlock and the flower on her hands and the $31 and the cookbook under her arm. She thought about the road to Blackstone and the man who had opened the door and looked at her like a problem he hadn't scheduled. She thought about the months between then and now. The table, the men, the documents, the waiting, the gradual understanding of what this place was and who the people in it were when they weren't performing. She thought about her mother's cookbook and the margin notes and the coffee stain on page 47. I want to tell you something first, she said. He waited. When I came here, I was someone who had lost everything and was trying to find out if there was still something I could build. She said it plainly, because plainness was the only honest register for this. I wasn't looking for this. I was looking for ground to stand on. And I found it here, and that happened because of you and Clem and the men and this kitchen and all of it. But I need you to know that what I've become here isn't the same as what I was looking for when I arrived. I know that. What I'm saying is that I'm not saying yes because I'm grateful. I'm saying yes because I know what you are and what this place is, and I've had enough time to understand the difference between needing somewhere to land and wanting somewhere to stay. She looked at him. Those are different things. I want you to know it's the second one. He was very still. Yes, she said. I'll stay. I'll build it with you. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, something quieter and more durable than a smile. The expression of a person who has been hoping for something they had mostly stopped believing they'd receive. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't say anything immediately. He simply sat with it. The way she had learned, he sat with things that mattered, letting them be real before he moved. Then he said, "The Thursday gatherings should have a proper table." She looked at him. "The kitchen table is too small. 7 people in mismatched chairs." He paused. "There's a table in the barn that came from my father's estate, long enough for 12, maybe 14. I don't know why I haven't brought it inside." She thought about 14 people around a table that had belonged to Rowan's father, in a kitchen that had belonged to a woman she'd never met, but whose ledger system she had admired and whose margin notes she sometimes felt she understood. "Bring it in," she said. She wrote the names in the cookbook 3 weeks later, not on a special occasion. There was no ceremony, no particular moment she had planned for it. She was sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, going through the week's accounts the way she did every Sunday. And she finished the last column and closed the ledger and picked up her mother's cookbook the way she often did in the quiet hours, and she turned to the last page. Her mother had left it blank. Not accidentally. The cookbook was full everywhere else, every page used, every margin annotated, but the last page had been left clean. Evelyn had thought about that blank page a great deal in the years since her mother died, had wondered if it was intentional or simply the last unneeded space in a well-used book. Now she thought she understood. Her mother had been a practical woman, not a sentimental one, and a blank last page in a cookbook was an invitation more than a mystery. She picked up the pen she kept on the kitchen shelf and she wrote 2 names in the corner of the blank page, Rowan and Evelyn Hayes. Then the year. Then, below that, in smaller letters, a single line in her own handwriting that was not a recipe and not an instruction, but something her mother might have written in a margin, if she'd thought of it. The table is not the ending. It is where things begin. She looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then she closed the book. She thought about what she had learned in the years that had brought her here, and what she understood now that she hadn't understood standing in front of Marcus Holt with flour on her hands and a folded eviction notice in her apron pocket. She had believed in that moment that what was being taken from her was a place, a building, a kitchen with a stained window and her mother's cast iron on the hooks. And those things had been taken. She wasn't wrong about that. But what she had understood slowly, over the months since, was that what Marcus Holt had never been able to take was the part of her that knew how to make a room feel like somewhere people wanted to be. That part was not in the building. It was in her, in the accumulated knowledge of what a table was for and what food meant and what it looked like when someone felt seen rather than simply fed. You can take a person's place. You cannot take what they carry. She had carried it here. She had set it down in someone else's kitchen and built something with it that was, she understood now, more than she had had before. Not just her mother's knowledge, but her own, added to it, the particular knowledge of a woman who had lost something and rebuilt from the ground, and learned in the rebuilding what was essential and what was not. The big table from Rowan's father's estate was in the kitchen now. It had taken 4 men to move it, and it barely fit, and in the evenings after dinner, when the men pushed their chairs back and the conversation ran long, it was full in a way that the old kitchen table could never have been. On Thursday afternoons, it was fuller still. Iris had brought her brother the last 2 weeks. Tully had brought his neighbor to the east. Clara's son had found, in conversation with Rowan on a Wednesday afternoon, the information he needed about the breed question and had gone home and made a decision that would change his next 3 years. She did not know, when she had opened the kitchen door to Clara Boone 3 months ago, that she was starting something. She had been making coffee for a neighbor and keeping the door open. But she understood now that this was how most of the things worth having were built. Not by intention, not by plan, but by consistent daily acts of attention and welcome that accumulated, without announcement, into something that held people. The ranch had changed. She could see it most clearly in the way the men moved through the days. With less of the tight-shouldered guardedness that had been there when she arrived, less of the braced quality of people waiting for something to go wrong. They were not without worry. The county inquiry into Granger's history was ongoing, and its outcome was uncertain, and there were still years of legal process ahead for the 2 families who had lost property to the Colbert surveys before Blackstone. Nothing was resolved cleanly. Life on a working ranch was still hard in all the ways it had always been hard, but the table was full. And Clem ate his coffee with its own pot every morning and argued with Denny about fence repair methods, and occasionally caught Evelyn's eye from across the room with the particular expression of a man who has watched something unfold and is glad he lived to see it. And Garrett and Pete had been friends for 3 months now. The debt between them dissolved in some conversation she had not witnessed and had not needed to, because the conditions for that conversation had been there when they needed it. And Harlan Pruitt, in Ridgeton, had received a letter from Rowan that she had not read but had watched Rowan write at the kitchen table on a Friday evening, slowly and with more care than she'd seen him give to most things. Whatever was in it, Pruitt had written back. The letter had arrived 2 weeks later, and Rowan had read it at the kitchen table in the early morning before anyone else was up. And when she came in at 4:30, he had been sitting with it in his hands, and he had looked at her and said simply, "He's all right," which meant something more than the words, and they both knew it. She stood up from the kitchen table and put the cookbook back on its shelf, the shelf where it had always been, where it would stay. She looked at the big table from Rowan's father's estate, at the 14 chairs that were too many for every night and exactly right for Thursdays, at the stove that was hers now in the way that things become yours after enough mornings of lighting them and tending them and depending on them. She was not the same person who had stood on the road to Blackstone with $31 and a cookbook under her arm. She was not entirely different either. She had been changed by this place the way places change you when you let them, not by replacing what you were, but by showing you which parts of it were real. Outside, the April evening was going dark, and the creek on the eastern boundary was running well, as it would continue to run through the summer, through the dry months, through the years ahead. The fence line was where it had always been. The land was where it had always been. And in the kitchen of Blackstone Ranch, the stove was warm and the table was long, and the last page of her mother's cookbook had 2 names written in the corner in handwriting that was clear and unhurried and intended to last. Some people spend their whole lives looking for the place where they are most themselves. Most never find it. Evelyn Mercer had found hers in a kitchen she had not chosen, in a life she had not planned, in the wreckage of something taken from her that had turned, in ways she could not have mapped from the beginning, into the very road that brought her here. She did not believe that loss was a gift. She had never believed that. Loss was loss and theft was theft, and Marcus Holt had taken something real from her, and the families Granger had wronged had lost real things that could not be entirely restored. The world did not organize itself around deserving. It did not reward patience with guarantees or punish theft with certainty. What it did sometimes was leave room. Room for a person who was paying attention to find what was needed and do what needed doing, and for that work to matter to the people around them, and for those people to become, without any of them deciding to, a place where someone belonged. The door was never locked at Blackstone. She had made sure of that from the first week, propping it open on the morning she was expecting no one, so that the warmth of the kitchen went out into the yard and the smell of bread followed it, and anyone passing who needed something to follow home could follow that. The door was open now. The stove was warm. And somewhere in the house, Rowan Hayes was reading by the lamp in the front room, and the men were settling into the bunkhouse, and outside the creek ran east along the boundary of a ranch that was still standing, and the night was quiet. In the particular way nights are quiet, when the worst thing that could have happened has not happened, and the people inside know it and are grateful without quite having words for what they're grateful to.